can I just introduce you
Oh
though?
yeah, great,
Please.
go ahead.
So, Lucia, I think you're actually sitting now in Oxford, is that right?
Oh no, I'm actually currently in Bournemouth, but based in Bristol. But I used to be in Oxford for my PhD.
Okay, fantastic. So, Dr. Lucia Rost is the research manager at Plan International, one of the member organizations of DSAI. Her background is in mixed methods research on children's rights and gender equality. Her PhD at the University of Oxford explored social norms related to unpaid care work, and her work with Oxfam, with UNICEF, and ODI investigated gender equality, economic empowerment, sexual health, and early childhood development. At Plan International, she leads and advises on a wide range of research projects that contribute to Plan International's programming and advocacy work, and with the aim of advancing children's rights and equality for girls. We all know Plan's great track record in that work. So, but also as well as the actual, if you like, social dimension of the work, they also incorporate climate change, education, early childhood development, and youth activism. So that linkage, I'm looking forward, and I'm sure we all are very much to hearing. So thank you, Lucia, and I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much. Can you see my screen, just to be sure?
We can, yeah. Thank you.
Perfect. So thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to speak today. As Catherine said, I'm a research manager at Plan International, and today I'll be talking about a research project I was recently leading on sexual well-being and consent. And we used a methodology where we worked with young co-researchers, and that's what I'll be focusing on. But I thought before I talk about the research, I briefly introduce Plan International for those of you who don't know much about what we do and how we use research. Then I talk about the research and particularly the Explore methodology, which is working with co-researchers. I present some of the key findings and recommendations and links to the resources, and hopefully there will be enough time for questions and answers. So very briefly, Plan International. Oh, actually, I have a video for you. I've included a few videos to make it a bit more interactive, just to introduce you to the kind of work we do at Plan International. I hope you can hear the sound. If not, please let me know. Can you hear it? Great.
Can you hear that? A better world is coming, where children can choose their own path, and girls like me aren't held back just for being girls. No more child marriage, no more street harassment, no more staying quiet, no more. It's already happening. We're being seen and heard. We're taking control of our bodies. We're learning about our rights. We're rebuilding our lives after a crisis. We're making a better future for ourselves. But we can't stop now. We won't stop now. What do we all want? To transform the lives of 100 million girls like me by 2022. It'll take all of us working harder than ever, but it is possible. This is our movement. This is our moment. To create lasting equality in our communities and across our countries. So children are born into a fairer world, where girls and boys can use their talent and energy to make things better for future generations. Each new voice makes us stronger. Are you with us?
Okay, yeah, just as an introduction to Plan International, you can see we have a strong focus on children's rights and especially equality for girls. In the video, it showed some of the themes that we are working on, which are also at the bottom of the slide. So it's around youth activism, child protection, early childhood development, education, SIHR, and youth economic empowerment. And we work in currently over 75 countries we work in. And in our work, research is increasingly becoming, I mean, it's always been important, but at the moment there's an increased focus on impact evidence, what we call it, which also includes monitoring evaluation. And we do research for three main purposes at Plan. So the first one is to influence policymakers, governments, and the international community. Which we call influencing. The second one is to improve our programming and program models. And the third one is to expand knowledge on issues that affect young people. But the third one on its own is not enough. We always need to meet one of the first two criteria as well in order to commission a research project at Plan. And all of this is then supposed to contribute to our programming and influencing work to advance children's rights and equality for girls. And with children, our age group is actually 0 to 24, so it's more like children's and youth rights, really. And we have a process which we call the MERL process. And I put it down a slide around how we conduct research. There's always a circular process of conceptualizing and designing, then planning, implementing, using, and then that reflection process at the end that feeds into the next project. And now one of the projects, one example of how we use research for programming work was the research project I was working on sexual well-being. So there the SIHR programmatic leads came to the research team and they said, we want to do more research into young people's perspective of sexual well-being and consent, because a lot of work generally in SIHR focus more on risks. It talks about, how can we reduce early pregnancy and STIs, etc., but it doesn't recognize that sexual well-being is such an important, like sexual activities can be contributing to sexual well-being, and it's very important for young people. And we need to understand this more and frame this more in our policy work and programming work. So we started this research project, I think 1 year ago, with 3 objectives. The first one was to understand what young people think, how they define sexual well-being and consent, and also understand the second objective was around the influencing factor, what contributes to young people experiencing sexual well-being and consent. And the third one was to formulate recommendations for us to further strengthen our programming work in this area. So here, this is the conceptual framework we used. It was developed by 2 consultants we worked with at Ghent University, Karolinska Institute and Rutgers. It's called the Sexual Wellbeing Framework, and you can see that sexual wellbeing is divided into 2 types of sexual wellbeing. So we have personal sexual wellbeing and relational sexual wellbeing on the right side. And whether young people achieve this sexual well-being is depending on the competencies that they have developed. So this is sexual literacy, gender equitable attitudes, respect for human rights, critical reflection skills, coping skills and stress management, interpersonal relationship skills. And as you can see as well, in the graphic on the right, we have the socio-ecological framework just behind the competencies. So whether young people actually use these competencies to achieve sexual well-being depends on these different factors at the individual, family, community, school, and societal level. So we use this framework for our research. I'll talk more about the findings later and how we applied the frameworks. But first of all, we worked with consultants from Karolinska Institute, Ghent University and Rutgers. We had a literature review and expert consultations. We worked with young people 18 to 24. We wanted to interview all younger ones, but that wasn't possible for legal reasons, or kind of our country office was concerned in Uganda because sexual activity was illegal for under 18-year-olds. Interview and focus group discussions in Ecuador were conducted and also in Uganda. And as I said, we used the Explore methodology, which meant working with adolescents in different stages of the research. We did some data validation workshops. And now I'll talk a bit more about the Explore methodology. So what I'll be presenting on is based on this toolkit. I put a screenshot there. You can download it online, and that's what we used as the basis for our methodology. So the Explore methodology was developed by Rutgers and IPPF, and it was designed to support organizations to involve young people in monitoring, evaluation, and research. And then the document, it clearly outlines 4 key advantages of why young people should not only be involved as participants, but also as researchers themselves. They say that this improves the quality of data. It can empower these young people as they learn skills, new skills and gain experience. It can improve partnership and cooperation and intergenerational dialogue between adults and young people. And it can improve in programmatic learning and program effectiveness. In the manual, they mention different types of participation. So young people can be involved in research design and planning, in data analysis, in disseminating results, but even in things like project management, finances, logistics, and report writing. But it's not always just, the more involvement, the better. It's important to really weigh up the pros and cons of involving young people in the different stages. And for that, they propose 3 questions. So one is the young person actually motivated? Do they want to be involved in this or not? Is it based on their informed choice? Then also, does it benefit them? And can you provide enough support so that it actually benefits them? And also, looking at the balance between participation and efficiency and between costs and benefits. So it's obviously costly involving young people. So if there are no real benefits, then yeah, I guess it's not advisable to do that. There's quite clear guidance around who should be involved and how to select them. So it's recommended to work with a youth-friendly supervisor who's good at capacity building and team management. And then for co-researchers, the recommendation is to work with 8 to 12 young people, an equal number of boys and girls. They should be friendly, from similar background or social position as the interviewees, non-judgmental, good listeners, not shy. They should have some experience in the subject matter, in this case SIHR, and about 2 years older than interviewees. So they're not too far removed, but still a little bit of a bit older than the interviewees. Safeguarding is really important, having the right referral processes in place. There might be some issues that others are envious of co-researchers, or that they harass, there's risk of harassment and all that. That needs to be kind of anticipated and mitigated for in risk assessment. And it's also very important to fairly compensate young co-researchers for their work. It's not just all about, oh yeah, we're giving them the experience and the skills. No, they're also doing work, and they do need to be paid for that. And so the Explore methodology includes 3 toolkits for training. So it really highlights that training is really important. And there's one particularly, it's more for program participants, the peer review handbook, which is the participatory ethnographic and evaluation research approach. Then there's one for monitoring, evaluation, and research, which is kind of broader. And then there's also a research training manual, which is the one that we used for our project. And all of these are available online. I'll share the links later. So how did we use this methodology? We worked with co-researchers in Ecuador, 3 young men and 3 young women who conducted interviews, focus group discussions, and validation workshops for us. And in Uganda, we wanted to follow the same approach, but because of COVID, we couldn't have the training and work with a larger group. So we ended up just working with a smaller group of researchers. But then we also formed an online youth expert panel who we had several meetings with, and they advised us on tools, analysis, and validation. So we had to adjust the approach there, but I actually thought it worked quite well having that youth expert panel as well. The advantages, we felt it facilitated access to young people, reduced power differentials between the researcher and the informant. The participants were very open. I mean, this topic is very, very sensitive, asking them what is, their sexual definition of sexual well-being, etc. But we really felt like participants were very open to talk about this with the young co-researchers. We also felt that the co-research brought in their own experiences and understandings, and that was really helpful because they knew the context and they knew, you know, what was relevant in this age group. We even conducted interviews with the co-researchers as well as part of the training, which was quite helpful for us to kind of understand the situation better. And we established good relationships with these young people and were able to involve them in other activities as well. For example, we decided to make a comic based on the findings. And then some of the co-researchers actually did the voiceover, or they provided feedback on the script, and some others participated in our launch event. So it was just very nice to have them engaged in different stages of the project. And we also felt it was in line with our global strategy, you know, to empower youth and, you know, skills and experience building. So that was good in that sense. We are learning, you have to be flexible. As I said, we couldn't do what we planned because of COVID restrictions. Training was really important. We had at least a week of training with each of the groups. And then it was kind of ongoing advising and one-on-one discussions throughout the data collection. Also, we found working with co-researchers who are slightly older very useful to have that little bit of authority as well. And we found that it didn't really work if boys interviewed girls. It should be, you know, the same sex interviewer. That worked better. And again, the fair compensation was a bit of a challenge, especially because we worked in different contexts in different countries and trying to make sure that it was all fair across the different countries as well. This is it about the methodology, the Explore methodology. Now I'll talk a bit about the research, what we actually found. And I have another video. As I said, we made a comic based on the research findings and also a short video, which I'll share with you to give you an idea of what we found.
You've been so excited about this workshop all week. How was it?
All right, let me start with this story John told us. He felt that all his friends were having sex, but he did not feel ready yet. The trainer shared that boys can take their time too. She said we may feel peer pressure, but we can decide when we want to do it. I was a little surprised. I did not know that boys thought about this.
In movies and shows, boys are always ready for sex.
Yeah, I thought only girls felt the pressure to have sex. I asked the trainer what is the best way of saying yes or no to sex. She explained that sometimes we speak through our words and other times through our body. She says it's best to communicate openly and clearly with our partners and to make decisions we are both comfortable with. She reminded us that information and services are important and that we should protect ourselves.
I wish I had learned about relationships and consent before.
OMG, I can relate.
Even now, I still find consent really complex. I really want to learn more about it.
Sophia told us how she really enjoyed sex with her boyfriend. She likes it even more now that she's a bit older and more experienced. We were all so curious about how she had such a positive experience. She told us about a comprehensive sexuality education her and her boyfriend had received. They had learned about relationships, gender and sexual diversity, safe sex and female pleasure, and had even gone to get condoms together. Sophia is also very close to her parents and is able to confide in them.
Wow, that sounds amazing.
Yeah, you know, it's so weird talking about this openly, but it feels good when we speak.
So yeah, as I said, the film already highlights some of the key findings. Here on this slide, I put some more key findings. We got a lot of rich data. It's very hard to summarize everything on one slide, but I tried my best. Really importantly, we found that young people did not experience sexual well-being in their relationships. Most of them said that that just simply wasn't possible, or it was even too ambitious to even kind of try they could achieve it. Consent is usually given through non-verbal clues, and is often misinterpreted, assumed, or difficult to achieve. And we found that young women faced more challenges than young men to experience sexual well-being and consent, and that traditional gender norms were a key barrier for sexual well-being and sexual consent, with young women being taught to learn and listen to men and please them. But the research also showed that some young women challenged these norms, and they were also said to be changing. Getting information on SHR issues was seen to be the most important factor contributing to sexual well-being. And young people really said that they wanted to learn more about sex and sexuality, and that should happen from an earlier age. And also very importantly, the role of parents came out a lot, that they play a crucial role in how young people navigate and establish relationships. And young people wish to have this open and warm relationship with their parents, where they can talk about these issues openly, but they regretted that that was often not the case, and that parents did not share their own experiences with sex and sexuality with their children. And now a bit more in depth about sexual well-being. So we asked them specifically to define sexual well-being, but only a few young people actually came up with a definition, which was a very broad range of definitions. Some people said it was like involving everything, and others were more specific about it being related to being comfortable in intimate relationships. Young people did not necessarily distinguish between what they considered to be sexual well-being and what they thought contributed to sexual well-being. So these influencing factors and the actual kind of what it is were kind of merged together. And so based on the framework I presented earlier, we looked at the different aspects of sexual well-being. So physical sexual well-being, personal aspects of sexual well-being included body satisfaction and comfort, self-esteem and self-love. For example, young people said that they took measures to increase their attractiveness, such as watching their diets and taking care of personal hygiene, and that could improve, or that was kind of part of sexual well-being. And for relational aspects, we looked at physical aspects, such as safe encounters, feelings of attraction and pleasure, and also emotional aspects were really important: love, happiness, being supported by a partner, respect, trust and faithfulness. And interesting, in Uganda, that wasn't part of the framework, but we added that in. There was this economic aspect of sexual well-being. So for boys, having money was considered essential for having sex. And for girls, having access to more economic resources meant that they were more likely to consent to having sex. So there was this thing around, paying for transport, giving girls gifts, and that was then accepting the gift was sometimes seen as a sign of consent. So on the one hand, this economic aspect can contribute to sexual well-being, as when girls said they felt more self-worthy, they felt like it was an expression of love getting these gifts, but it can also increase power imbalances and encourage young women to engage in sexual activities, even if they don't actually want to. And also some men actually said they felt used, or they felt like there was a lot of pressure to always, provide gifts. So that was the relational aspects of sexual well-being. But as I said, most overall, young people felt it was very difficult to achieve sexual well-being, and that it was almost too ambitious to even try to. And for sexual consent, we looked at 4 types of consent. Direct verbal signals, which is verbally asking for consent, and this was barely used across the research context, and if it was just used mainly by boys. The second type was direct non-verbal consent, such as touch, responding to a kiss. This was the most common type of consent being used. Then there was also indirect verbal consent, inviting someone to come and visit or asking them to watch Netflix were some examples, which, as I said before, is obviously a risk of misinterpretation, and it's just assumed. Indirect nonverbal consent, accepting a gift, dressing provocatively, befriending siblings or parents, or coming to a boy's home was also seen as consent. So it was clear from the research that consent was mostly interpreted and assumed. And for a lot of young people, it was a new concept. They had not heard about it, or they didn't quite know what it was. But when they were asked to define it or to think about it, it became clear that it was much more complicated than just a formal yes or no. It was a much more layered and complex than that. Also found that consent was heavily gendered. And Uganda, there was this assumption that boys initiate sexual activities and girls were expected to refuse at first, and then a no was kind of almost said to mean yes. So again, this kind of complication and all these different layers. Consent was difficult to apply in daily life for young people, but they said it was easier to achieve in serious relationships as opposed to casual relationships, and for older youth who were said to be more experienced and having that kind of confidence. So yeah, somehow see consent is complex. That was one of our key findings. Let me see how much time I've left. I think I cut this short. We looked at the different levels of the socio-ecological framework, different factors influencing sexual being and consent. At the individual level, we had sex assigned at birth, age, personality, and situation. So here, for example, it's interesting, people were saying if someone has dreams and aspirations about what they want to do with their lives, that was going to influence sexual well-being. For example, they might delay pregnancy and use contraception and be more patient about engaging in sexual activities if they have more kind of life plans. Safe sex and contraceptive use was very important part of sexual well-being that they felt that could really contribute to them feeling more, having a more positive sexual experience if they felt safe in doing it. Partners, as I said, yeah, relationships are obviously very important. Love was said to be key to sexual well-being, and also respect and trust. And parents again, so young people regretted that parents did not talk to them about SIHR issues. With friends, it was interesting because on the one hand, friends were actually said to make it harder to experience sexual well-being because they were putting pressure on young people to do things they didn't feel ready for. They were even giving them incorrect information. But then on the other hand, there was a lot of examples and quotes where friends had been supportive and had been teaching young people about SIHR, which they weren't taught by their parents or their or at school. There were different cultural practices and myths in different countries. NGOs participants were quite keen on SIHR interventions and programming, especially CSE, Comprehensive Sexuality Education. And at school, also they all said, many of them said they would like to be taught more about this at school, and they said it wasn't taught enough. A lot of young people got their SIHR information on social media and the internet, which could contribute to sexual being if they increased their knowledge, but it also had significant risks because of misinformation and disinformation. There was, in both countries, there was taboos around young people's sexuality, and that influences access to information and the ability to communicate openly about SIHR, which negatively affect sexual well-being. And as mentioned before, traditional gender norms can also be a barrier to experience sexual well-being. But yeah, there were also examples of gender norms not being put in practice, where girls could express what they wanted and were respected for it. And this was mainly the case where partners loved each other. And there were also examples of young men who did not behave in line with traditional male gender norms. Laws and policies in Uganda in particular, young people said that laws that protect girls from sexual violence were really important and would make them feel safer and contribute to their sexual well-being, but they regretted that these laws were often not reinforced. That was it on the findings. Here's just an overview of what we did with these findings, how the recommendations we came up with for our programming. So very importantly, in the general recommendations, we recommend to embrace a sex-positive approach. So we have been starting doing this across the organization to raise awareness about, moving away from the sexual risk perspective that I mentioned earlier and talking more of the positive aspects. Also engaging youth in SIGR program and influencing work, including young adolescents, is very important. And the second set of recommendations is around strengthening individual agency. And here the focus is on CSE, comprehensive sexuality education, which is actually the core component of our work on SIGR, and also involving families. And that came out very clearly in the research. And lastly, we also recommend to create an enabling environment, which means challenging gender norms, harmful gender norms, ensuring that legal and policy frameworks on age and sexual consent do not restrict adolescents and young people's rights and their access to SIGR information, education and services. And also, as always, investing in more research. We identified some more gaps. So you can find more details on the report, the recommendations. I have a list of researchers which I can also put in the chat. So we have the report. There are two versions of the report, a more accessible version and a longer version. A literature review, and also this comic and film, which you saw a short version of previously. And I also have links to the Explore Methodology Toolkit. This is it for me. I think we still have enough time. Yeah, we have enough time for questions or discussion. It would be great to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Lucia, thank you so much for that. So would anybody like to kick off? Yes, I see Carlotta.
Hi, thank you so much, Lucia, for your very interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it, and yeah, it was very illuminating. And I'm particularly interested in it because I am a PhD student in Trinity College researching the connection between child marriage and climate change. And I'm doing research on whether child marriage is being used as a coping mechanism to adapt to climate change in vulnerable communities in Zimbabwe. And I'm going to Zimbabwe in July for a pilot visit to visit the communities and talk to the girls in this district. And I was very interested in your methodology of involving young people in your research. And I think that would be like a really good methodology for my qualitative data collection as well. And I was wondering if you have any other recommendations or tips that I might would be good for me to think of when I go to Zimbabwe this July.
Thanks. That sounds super interesting and very much like something that is very much linked to the work we do as well. So
yeah.
Child marriage is a big topic, and then climate change as well. And actually climate change, we are now often recognized recently in the kind of for global strategy update that climate change needs to kind of come across all these different thematic areas that we were talking about. So it's really interesting to look at the linkages. And actually the linkages between SIGR and climate change is also something we have been really thinking about and how we should look into this. So yes, please share your findings with us. It would be great to hear. In terms of the methodology, I think the Explore toolkits, I put the links in the chat, can be quite a useful starting point also, because it includes guidance around how do you conduct training or what do you need to consider. I think even just working with a few young people as co-researchers can be helpful. You don't need to just stick to the methodology and do everything exactly according to the book. I think my advice would just be, getting someone you can work with in Zimbabwe who has experience in that area, and also just discussing with them, seeing, how to involve young people in which stages would be best, what they think would be useful, and then just talking to some young people and seeing also what they would like in terms of their involvement, just having that discussion. Yeah,
that's really helpful. Thank you so much. And I was wondering if you maybe want to leave your email address so I could maybe contact you in the future.
Of course, yeah, I'll put it in the chat.
That's great. Thank you so much.
I see somebody else has their hand up, but I can't see their picture or face. So if you want to join in, please.
My name is Helen. I have my hand up. I don't know if I can go
Hi,
ahead.
Helen.
Is
Yes.
it okay?
Yes, please, Helen.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. That was an interesting, both researches have been very interesting. I have a question. So my question is based, my MSc research was on Sustainable Developmental Goal number 4, which is quality education. And I was looking at quality teacher training. Okay, and one of the things I found out was that, you know, we have policies here and they work here. But when you go to, in quote, a developing country, say Africa, and you try to use those policies, they really don't work because the policies and reality, there's that lacuna, that gap. So I just want to know what your take is on that and how this can be addressed based on your research. Thank you.
It's a good question. I mean, I'm not an expert on teacher training, but I know, actually I did another research project recently, also with the SIHR Hub on CSE, so comprehensive sexuality education, and teacher training came up a lot in there. And that research project was interesting actually because it was different to the one I presented on, because it was operational research where we really worked with program, like people working on the ground in 3 countries and interviewing project participants, but also staff and colleagues and partners from the ministry and other organizations, and asking them, you know, what works in CSE? How do you do these teacher trainings? Exactly, that was one of the questions. Who should you recruit? Who should be doing these trainings? What are their skills and requirements? How did you do them in the past? What worked? Like these really practical questions. And that was then compiled from 3 countries. It was Laos, El Salvador, and Zimbabwe. And this knowledge from these 3 countries would then generate into kind of some recommendations that can be applied more broadly in other contexts as well. But I think something like that around, you know, really talking to people on the ground who've implemented this type of work, that was really useful, because as you say, yeah, and that's what we felt with this research project. We had these high-level UNESCO guidelines on CSE, but how are they applied on the ground? How do they actually, you know, what works and what doesn't work? So that's actually something we looked in with that research, and I put a link to that research project in the chat as well.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen.
And my hand is up. Can I ask a question?
Please, Dixon, go ahead.
Okay. So it was an interesting presentation, Rost. I used to work with an NGO that was into child rights whilst I was in Ghana. And we tried to introduce comprehensive sexuality education in some schools. But the problem is some parents frown on it. They prevent their children from being educated on such topical issues. So don't you think we have to channel our resources into sensitizing parents so they know of the importance of allowing their children to engage in such topical issues?
That's a really good question, something we come across all the time in our CSE work. I mean, there's a lot of resistance to it, not just by parents, but also others. We still feel that, you know, the evidence shows that CSE has such huge benefits in so many different areas. It's very important to have these conversations, to be kind of, you know, obviously sensitive, but also, you know, having these conversations. Actually, we developed something that's called Conversations That Matters, which is like a journey or like a training program for SIHR staff across the organization to really talk about these things. How do you address them? How do you talk to people about these sensitive issues? How do you make sure there's not backlash? And how do you still push for it? Because it is important to give young people, as we heard from this research, young people do want to be taught about these things, and this kind of silence is not necessarily helpful. And we have also developed some, which you might want to look at, some CSE standards, which kind of help program, like CSE programming across the organization. And that's also plays a role in there, you know, it's about how there's one around the enabling environment, and that also involves, you know, how do you create that space to even have an open discussion about that. But yeah, interesting discussion.
Sorry, I don't see any other hands up. And if you don't mind, Breda Gahan, who has been concerns HIV and AIDS and health advisor for many, many years. And Breda, I just wonder, do you have a comment in terms of what you've heard from Lucia, particularly around, you know, openness in talking about sexual matters and how that might or might not impact on HIV and AIDS awareness?
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, actually, my master's thesis from Liverpool University way back was on education for safer STI HIV prevention among adolescents in Tanzania. So I faced some of the issues Lucia mentioned, and it was really important to have a peer male interview peer males and a female to interview females. And finding the local words for what we have in English is really important, that older and young people recognize the language I might use here in Ireland for sexually transmitted infections and HIV are not necessarily the language they use even for sexual intercourse or sexual engagement. So really exploring the local language through focus group discussions. I'm a nurse midwife. Talking to midwives was really important because they, again, know the local language. And unfortunately, as we know, too many even younger adolescents are having pregnancies and dropping out of school in many of the countries we're concerned and all of you are working and focusing on. So it's communication, talking locally, as Helen and was it Duncan mentioned, you know, with people in the solution lies within. So, I mean, Kate, I often joke to you that, you know, I think we'd find it difficult if Concern went to a rural village in Tipperary or Cork to say we're going to have a meeting on sexual health and, you know, without any really good preparation. I mean, it's highly sensitive. And I agree with, you know, there's risk and vulnerabilities, but we also need to focus on positive sexual health and well-being. We know the mental health anguish that's being caused, and particularly as young people are telling us they couldn't shift or go out. Sorry for non-Irish people. Shifting is meeting a partner. During the COVID pandemic, there weren't bars open, there weren't cinemas, there weren't clubs. So I think it's ongoing engagement and conversation and listening to what young people are saying. And I think they're the best ones to tell us how we might engage with their parents, traditional authority leaders, say in Malawi, midwives, and the influential local people. Once they understood the risk of HIV in Tanzania, everybody wanted, I mean, there were too many funerals then. This is before treatment. Everybody at that time who developed HIV died. I was working with GTZ and PSI and other local organizations with Concern doing the research, and I learned more doing that research, I think, than I've ever learned about HIV and STIs and the importance of communication in developing countries. Thanks, Kate.
Thank you, Breda. Now, folks, we hadn't actually scheduled it in, and Stephanie, if you wouldn't mind, we've had a lot of wonderful presentations and a lot to think about. So would people mind if we took a 10-minute break? And Stephanie, if we started at 20 to 12, is that okay with you? Great. Okay, thanks, folks. See you in 10 minutes.